Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Michael from The Honest Youth Pastor, the channel that helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. Tonight, we are going to be doing that with a graphic perhaps you've seen. We're going to be talking about marriage specifically. I know marriage is coming up. You may have heard about the Respect for Marriage Act. We're not necessarily going to get into that so much. As much as we are going to be looking at a graphic that I was sent after I tweeted out the other day that if you can't define marriage as a Christian, well, you need to ask yourself some serious questions, because marriage is between a man and a woman, a covenant union there. And then somebody sent me a graphic because apparently they don't think I've read the Bible. We'll get into that in a moment. But before we get into that, I want to, we're going to bring, well, I've got to find the screen I'm looking at here. We're going to bring, Matt and Josh on per normal. Guys, welcome again to another Tuesday live stream.
Oh, hey, what's up, buddy?
So tonight we're going to be looking at a graphic, talking about marriage specifically. It's a tense topic, apparently. Apparently people don't know how to define that anymore, along with a lot of other terms that we have. So we're going to just hop into it because we only have an hour, and there's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 8 sort of sections of this graphic that somebody sent the other day that we really want to take a look at. And you guys may have seen it. It'll be on your screens now if you're watching. And hopefully it's big enough. I can't really make it too much bigger without losing resolution. But the idea when somebody sent me this graphic was, well, you say marriage is between a man and a woman, but Exhibit A, and then we have a lot of different things here, man plus woman, but then it's based on the bride who cannot prove her virginity is then stoned to death. We'll address that. Then they address concubines. They talk about women as property, talking about polygamy. Sisters' Wives comes to mind. Apparently, that's a show people still watch. And then we have a man marrying his dead brother's wife. We have some R word that I can't say on YouTube without getting demonetized. And then there's some other stuff we'll look at here as we go. So I guess we'll just intro real quick about, and I know the answer to this, and I think the people watching probably know the answer to this, but have you guys heard these arguments before in regards to, oh, well, you say marriage, but here's all these examples of not? Matt, you want to go first?
Yeah, I always think that it is so extremely ironic when there is a wide conversation that is going on, and particularly in social media, and there is, we'll say, the Judeo-Christian side, and then whatever other side that there may be, and the side which is opposing, we'll say, the Judeo-Christian worldview or biblical view, comes along and then throws something out there from our side of the fence as if it is this nail in the coffin linchpin that we had never considered before. And we're like, yeah, we know all of these things are in the back of our mind as we're saying this. Like it's nothing new for us per se. It may be new to them, I guess, because we do have a tendency to have kind of like this sadistic glee when we sort of like think that we've discovered someone's Achilles heel, and then it's
like the base of every internet argument. I gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. And then it always just boils down to a proof texting feud. Mm-hmm. is essentially what happens, and that literally will never go anywhere, except just continue the proof text feud. But yeah, so I guess that's hopefully what we're going to do a little bit tonight is try to systematize some of this, look at it in context. Definitely look at it in its original Old Testament setting, but then ultimately through the lens of the revelation in Jesus Christ.
Yeah. What do you got any additions to that, Josh, there?
I think the only addition I would make, and it's really building off what Matt said, is that for things like this, right, this idea of marriage in this graphic, I think you need to start with a really good biblical theology, where you have a really good understanding of the Bible, of context, historical context, what's trying to be communicated in Deuteronomy, who's the audience, right? It's Israel. Where is Israel while this is going on, that they're receiving this law, and why? And then as you understand those things from a biblical point of view, then you can start to dial it in and arrive at conclusions on marriage. And then that will help you deal with each of these specific instances throughout the Old Testament, which all of these are in the Old Testament, right? This idea of biblical marriage here is lacking in a New Testament reference to marriage, right? So that's kind of the glaring missing piece, is what did Jesus have to say about marriage in the New Testament? So, and we can get into that later. But I think starting with a good biblical theology is always helpful with these things. And this is where understanding how to read your Bible and, knowing what a hermeneutic is, and having a good hermeneutic, and knowing how you approach Scripture, so that when you do come to these kinds of hard passages, it's not something that's oh no, what do I do now? This is where we need to kind of buckle in and really dig into the text and try to understand, what was being communicated and what are the implications for us today.
Yeah. So as we do this, I do want to point out, because I don't want to make this sort of a only people that are outside of the faith are going to try to use this, because there have been ex-evangelical accounts, deconstruction accounts that use this exact graphic as sort of this, but marriage hasn't always been consistent kind of argument. And I think that's one of the things one of the stated goals of the page, of this channel, is to hopefully help believers, like you said, understand history, context, hermeneutic, so that when we're presented with things like this, we're able to say, okay, well, let's work through this in a way that is helpful, is honest to the text. And part of doing that is honestly, going to the text, or just, maybe coming back and be like, all right, I'm gonna have to study this a little bit, because this graphic here is pretty daunting. If somebody were just to send this to you, you're gonna have to go, okay, I'll get back to you, because there's a lot here. You've got polygamy, you've got concubines, you've got some things just thrown in that are a little odd as far as like the dead brother's widow, that sort of thing. So let's start going. I guess I want to end with the first slide they have, as far as the man plus woman equals nuclear family. I want to end there. So we'll kind of work our way, I guess, backwards. Obviously, this isn't sort of through the text, but as far as chronological. But we'll deal with that as we can. So the bottom, if you guys can't see it, the bottom right hand is male slave plus female slave, basically saying slave owner could assign female slaves to male slaves. Female slaves must submit to their new husbands. Basically, the idea is saying that marriage is just can be decided by anybody if a guy wants to put two people together. Again, this is Exodus 21:4. What this maybe I don't want to say least controversial, but this technically fits into male woman, one man, one woman sort of thing here. I think their big problem would be this is sort of a forced situation dealing with slaves and not. What would be, Matt, your first sort of, as we're just looking at this, if somebody brings this up to you, what are you saying to this?
So first, we kind of have to work through the difficulty surrounding the verb for to give or to set, which is the Hebrew natan, and which here in Exodus 21, 21:4, it is yitin. So if a man appoints, sets, gives, places the slave a wife, those are all potential translations for that. And so depending on the particular wording or phrasing that we want to use here, we can cause ourselves some trouble, because then we read the English word back into this cultural setting and use our own social cultural standards as a way to critique that. And I say that because let's say if we translate this as the graphic is intending it to be translated as, that if his master, or if a man gives or if a man, we'll say, appoints his slave a wife, then that would, of course, agree with the sentiment of the graphic here, that it is something that is against both the will of the wife and the husband. Then, viewing that through the lens of our modern auspices, we're going to say, hey, that's probably not something that we need to do. But if we read it in the context of the master giving the slave a wife, that sort of softens the situation a little bit, because it's more the idea of the Hebrew slave is serving his master for a period of 7 years. This Hebrew servant, or abad, or however you want to translate, slave, servant, um, whatever word you want to put in there, but is going to serve him for 7 years, and then is going to have the opportunity to be set free. But let's say this servant doesn't have anything to return to, and he enjoys working in this contract under his master, even though it may be a contract of slave labor, we'll say. They may come into an agreement with the master and say, hey, yeah, I mean, I like this other servant, or I would like to be married and to continue working in your household. So if you set me up with the marriage and provided me a place to sleep and something to eat and things to do to give my life meaning, then yeah, I'll stay married to her. I'll stay a slave for you, even beyond my normal 7 years. And so that changes things a little bit. And now I'm not saying that it has to be either or. It could be both ways, because if this is a law in ancient Israel based on human nature and consistency of evil, there probably were some evil masters who, took two people and like, hey, you are going to get married in this instance. Whether what the stipulations were surrounding that, like, we don't know. There are probably plenty of abuses of these kinds of allowances, but the condition of these situations is really dependent on how you read it. And we don't necessarily have very many narratives in scripture where this type of thing is actually worked out. So it's hard to know.
Yeah, well, and I think the important part here, as we discuss this, and Josh, I'll come to you in just a minute on this, and we'll kind of see how we might have to speed up going through these a little bit. I might have to go back and forth between us, the three of us, as we go through this. We'll see how it works. But I think the important part is, as we get through this, and like Matt was saying, oftentimes we're looking at this and then with our cultural lenses, looking back into it and being like, that would be terrible.
Right.
But because of doing that, we're missing the fact that there are a lot of cultural norms here that Israel is living in, that God is giving them standards for. This is how you live in this setting now. And much of them, I mean, for example, when we get to the male soldier taken a prisoner of war, I mean, some of these even allow for really care for the people that are in these situations. Now, again, we would read it back and be like, this is terrible. But these are rules set up in some regards, like you said, for the betterment of the person in that particular cultural setting. So for us, it looks absolutely terrible because of the cultural settings we are living in, and reading back into them with our modern standards, we're going, I don't like that. But for the time they're living in, and I think, and I don't know this, Matt, you may know this, Josh, you may know this, but I'd be interested to know, like, cultures around them, different type of belief systems around them, if, where that rate, I mean, is actually other tribes or other culture systems actually way worse in regards to how they would treat this, or how they would, handle situations like this, opposed to what God gives Israel to say, okay, here is your standard and this is how you must treat people. I don't know that off the bat. I think that would be helpful, but I don't know that. So
it is going to look closely similar. I mean, there's going to be some differences, but a lot of these general social economic laws that you're going to see throughout the entire Pentateuch is going to be somewhat similar to the culture and the societies that Israel is coming out from, that are living in the midst of. The primary differences are going to be that there are going to be many more redeemable aspects and motivations in this Israelite law.
Gotcha. Given the time that we have, I think we're gonna speed this up. And Josh, we're gonna go to the next one as far as the male soldier plus prisoner of war, so we can kind of try to get through these and address them as best we can. On that, if somebody comes up to you and says, "Okay, well, you say marriage is between a man and a woman, but your very own Bible is talking about, hey, God says if you go into a land and you capture it and you see some lady and you like her a lot, you can take her." So what do you have to say to that, Josh?
Well, I would start off by, so if we looked at, the Pentateuch, right, first 5 books of the Bible, that's, it's the law of Moses. What was given is akin to case law, right? So today, right, if you take someone to court, right, and there has to be a judgment pronounced, the judge doesn't just make up his mind and decide on his own, right? He reviews case law, and based on previous case law and cases that have been decided, that guides his opinion on what he thinks should go based on the facts and evidence. It's possible something arises that's never been addressed before, and then he sets the precedent then that future judges will use. And so the Pentateuch, and in these particular situations, they were given to Israel, not in a vacuum, but rather within their entire society, so that their elders and their judges had something in reference that they could use to guide their decisions as these outlying situations arose. And I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of these are outlying situations. These are not necessarily norms, right? These are extremes. And in the event that an extreme like this should happen, where you're commanded to go into Canaan and you have to wipe a people out, but lo and behold, you didn't, right? There's still some women there. Well, what do? Do we just kill them? Or can you take them as a wife and care for them? Right? And it's certainly a different perspective than we would have today. In fact, when we go to war, that's not even our goal at all, right? We want to minimize civilian casualties. We don't want collateral damage. We have just war theory and, some lady named Geneva that governs what we do or don't do. So that's kind of our perspective on things. But what's happening here is, so for all of these cases, save probably the Genesis one, these are all case law to help the elders of Israel make determinations as circumstances arise. And if we get to some of the other more aggressive ones, right, you will see that there are variations. There's various scenarios, and they're very specific. And that's to help guide the decision as what there should be made. And I think that applies to this one with a soldier, right, who takes a woman from someone that had just been captured. It applies to these slaves who have just been married. The other thing that we see along with this case law, and this is something that most people haven't thought of, what's glaringly missing from the law and from Israel society in the Pentateuch is any kind of jail system or police force, right?
Yeah.
They didn't put people in jail. There was no police force out doing these things. And the goal of all of these laws was the redemption of people, to include the perpetrators. And so it's interesting that in many of these cases, the result is a new family, right, where people have to be cared for, where a community now is involved around the perpetrator and the victim in some cases, right, depending on which one we're talking about. And it's not to diminish what happened, but it is to say that both of those people are redeemable. They can be redeemed instead of just throwing them in a jail cell and wasting them for the rest of their lives. Right? And so that's a perspective that's been lost on us as Westerners, because our cries for justice are, well, they need to go to jail for 30 years. They need to do this, that, or the other. We very rarely think, how can this person be redeemed? Right? And that's one of the ways that the Old Testament law points towards the redemption of Christ in the New Testament.
Gotcha. Interesting take. Yeah, I didn't even thought about that really. Moving on, and I think this is similar to what you were saying, and I'll take this one because it's not fair for me to just push these off on you. On the next one, as far as the R word and his victim, it's interesting how this is worded, and this is why I would encourage you guys that if somebody sends you a graphic like this, I mean, I'm glad they provided the scriptural references. That's at least helpful and shows that they're at least trying to be somewhat intellectually honest about it. But if you read the verses, the idea here in Deuteronomy 22 verses 28 and 29 is the idea that when he has to, so at the second line there is that he must pay the victim's father 50 shekels of silver for property loss. It's not necessarily accurate in regards to the bride price. The idea that it's essentially I am now taking responsibility for the action that I committed, and it's not so much here it's again this whole idea of women as property, which we'll get into in another one, but it's actually the bride price, and he has to take responsibility and make her his wife because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all of his days. There's no out for him on this. This thing is, you've done this thing, and now you must take responsibility for it. Now, again, that does not negate, nor actually, Scripture puts into place safeguards to say, you now have to take care of her. You did this horrendous thing, and now not only do you have to take care, I mean, you are paying the bride price for her, you are now taking her on as your wife, and you're not allowed to divorce her. So good luck, buddy. Like, you now have to take responsibility for the thing you did. And I get the pushback on the end of, again, our modern sensibilities of saying, like, how is that fair to her? Like, that she now has to marry the guy that violated her, which admittedly, yeah, that's for us pretty problematic. But and I've disappeared, but you can hear my voice from the nether world, so just go with it. My camera it may come back, it may not. But the idea here is that, he now has to take care of her. And in that society and in that culture, unless I'm totally off, which I don't think I am, that's actually better for her. Because if she had been violated, she's not going to be able to be married off to another man. No one else is going to want her. And now this actually at least provides her with stability, a family, and a way to, again, redeem a very terrible situation. So we're operating, at least in this regard, within a cultural system that at least enables her to have a life that is, again, we could question if if there's a better way or not, but within that culture, at least she has stability and someone to care for her, with the stipulation that there isn't a way out for you. I mean, dude, you can't leave her. You've done this thing, and now you must take responsibility for it. So we can argue the ethics of it in regards to through our modern lenses, but for the cultural system that's set up, and again, I'm glad that Matt, you clarified as far as like very similar rules, around them. So this idea is that now, hey, you take responsibility for it. Which I get doesn't gloss over the whole situation, but it does at least provide, again, like you were saying, Josh, redemption as best as possible for the situation that she now finds herself in, and makes the man, which is, again, the argument of almost, I mean, if you talk about alimony or child support, he has to take responsibility. There is no way for him not to. And again, with your idea of, community and that society makeup, there are people there to make sure he does that. Yeah, there's no way out for him on that. So we'll move on to the next one, Matt, for you. The man and the brother's widow, in regards to the idea here that the widow who had not born a son is required to marry the brother-in-law. And she also, a lot of these are, again, repetitive. She must submit to him in there. I mean, it's this, hey, you're forced to do this thing because now there's a lot of forced sexual encounters here, which is, again, why I think it's framed in a very negative way.
Yeah, so the way that this is framing it is putting it in, as you said, in a very forced framework without any kind of choice at all, and that's simply not the case. we find lots of examples of widows, of women who may have never married again. And so in these situations with the we call it like the kinsman redeemer, it's actually the man or the brother or the cousin who is under constraint more so than the widow is, because the widow may choose not to remarry if she doesn't have to, or if she chooses not to, of course, then she's not going to have anyone to support her, and she's going to have a very difficult life if she never does remarry and have children in that culture and in that time period. But it's really more so on the shoulders of the one who is closest to the deceased man to step up and to take that role on, because in that situation, he's the one who no longer has the choice. Like, he's the one who has to marry his sister-in-law if he wants to get married. He couldn't just say, "Oh, well, I want to marry this lady instead." The community is going to say, "No, you're if you want to get married, you're going to have to marry your I guess, I don't know, ex sister-in-law at this point, now getting ready to become your wife." And the idea about having to submit sexually to her new husband, in Jewish tradition, at least, in much later time periods, specifically in rabbinic Judaism, and these are the people who have done the most interpretation on these laws. But in rabbinic Jewish tradition, it is the woman who initiates sexual intercourse. It is actually extremely taboo for the man to be the one to initiate it. It's actually the female's prerogative. Now, I'm not saying that these passages and the Levitical and Mosaic laws are assuming that this is going to be the case, but the effects of these laws being enforced and practiced and handed down over throughout generation after generation, these laws did not create this horrendous society in which women were constantly sexually manipulated and abused. I mean, that does happen. That happens in every culture, in every society. It's horrible. It's terrible. It is a part of our fallen, corrupted human condition. But these laws created a sexual context in which it is the woman's prerogative to engage in sexual intercourse for the sake of conception and so forth.
Gotcha. Well, and again, I think that's very helpful. This is where it comes into the understanding the context, the culture, and the sort of societal norms that oftentimes, because we're looking back with our lenses, we just don't know. Like, we're assuming, like Josh said, we're assuming that these regulations are somehow set on top of what we're under our understanding, whereas actually it's not even close to that at all. And of course, some of that comes back. And what we've seen up to this point in every one of these situations is it's actually for the protection of the woman, given the culture and the context. It's actually protecting her as best as can be done, given the situation that she finds herself in, which I find ironic because most of the arguments are the Bible hates women, which is, if you look at this idea here, clearly that's not the case. I mean, all of these rules are set up to avoid, having her in a situation that's bad. So let's move on to polyamory here, Josh. This next one, as far as now, we have a lot of examples given. Now, again, these don't have necessarily Bible verses like the other ones do, but it does give sort of a list through as far as Lamech, Esau, Jacob. It goes through and demonstrates with Solomon coming in with the high count of 700 on top of the apparently wife leaderboard over here. But so this is the most common out of all of them, as far as like, oh, well, biblical marriage clearly isn't biblical, because if it was biblical, look at all these wives that these people had. I hear this one over every other one.
Right.
Yeah.
So would it be cool if we combined the polygamy with the concubines?
Oh, yeah,
pretty
go for it.
closely
Yeah.
related,
Mhm.
right? And it is interesting that neither one of them has scripture attached to them, right? It's pretty significant. When you look at the chart, everything's got scripture with it, but these two do not, because never at any point in time does scripture have anything pertaining to this, right? It never prescribes it, and it doesn't have any laws concerning it, right? So that tells us something, that the Bible is silent on this. So if we were to go back again to the Pentateuch, and in this sense, I will reference that first one, right? You have this idea of marriage in Genesis, then mankind falls, and you see this descent, right, from where he was created down to the first sin, right, and then we get down to Cain killing Abel, and there's this continual descent all the way until Lamech takes 2 wives, and it's never looked upon necessarily as a good thing, right? It's one of those things that happened and was allowed to happen, but that's not necessarily saying, hey, this is a good thing, go do it, right? There are a lot of things that are in the Bible that occur and are historically written down in the narratives, but that's not the Bible giving approval to those things either.
Yeah.
Right. And this is one of those cases where it happened and it was allowed to happen, and culturally it happened even outside of Israel. Right. Abraham was not a Jew. Right. Not in the sense that Israel was coming out of Egypt. Right. Abraham came out of Ur. Right. And so he was part of that cultural context he was in. There was multiple wives. So I think in that instance, this is where you have to kind of take a step back and say, well, did the Bible prescribe and approve multiple wives and concubines? No. Did it happen? Yes. Like a lot of things, a pretty cursory reading of Solomon should show that those wives wasn't a good thing, right?
Yeah.
It specifically says that because of all of his wives, it led his heart astray, and as a result, it ended in child sacrifice. That's not a good thing. Right. Personally, I think when you read the narratives of Solomon, they are presented in such a light that they can be taken either in the positive or the negative. And I err and tend towards a negative reading of Solomon, which is a bit of a minority view. And that even colors the Song of Solomon, right, where he's wooing this young woman, and the images in that are not that great. Right. She doesn't want to go out into the city for fear of being raped. For fear of being violated by the guards. Sorry, man.
You're good.
For fear of the guards coming after her, right? There's all these this negative imagery that's also in Song of Solomon. And it's the result of this idea of polygamy and concubinage. And the ideal marriage in the Song of Solomon is that young woman and her lover. I think those are 2 separate people. That's a separate podcast issue, whatever. But for the purposes of this, I think the Bible has always defined marriage as a single man and a woman, and it has always been the standard. And mankind has, to a certain degree, almost always tried to twist that in one way or another, either with multiple wives, or through divorce, or through polyamory, or through illicit affairs, or open marriages, or all sorts of other crazy things that we've come up with, instead of what the Lord designed, and all of it is a result of sin in Genesis 3.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things, we'll get to it when we get to the top, but one of the kind of bad things that's put under the, the man and woman nuclear family is the interfaith marriage is forbidden. Like, that's the bad thing. But when you actually get down to the concubines and the polyamory, you can reference verses that tell you what's going to happen. Deuteronomy 7:3-4, Micah 2:11. Like, the whole thing that happens that you've mentioned is the reason that interfaith marriages are bad ideas. So yeah, I think that's I found that ironic, and it made me giggle a little, because I thought you're naming that as a bad thing, and then it proves itself out in the last. So Matt, when we're moving on, because Josh did a 2 for there. Well, I guess I could do this. Well, I'm interested because you got like a lot of history and knowledge here. So when we get to Genesis 16, I find this, first of all, interesting because they put Genesis 16 under the man, woman, and woman's property situation. Genesis 16 is the, I had it marked. I think it's the Abraham-Sarah situation. Sarah and Hagar situation. So when this comes up, the man could acquire his wife's property as well as her, and then do with what he wanted. So what would you say? And somebody, again, the same question over and over again. Hey, marriage is between a man and woman, you claim, but then you have Abraham. You have sort of a patriarch of the faith here doing this. So how do you say marriage is just between a man and a woman then?
My first reaction would be blame Hurrian law. Abraham was a Hurrian, which was, a late Bronze Age dynasty in northern Mesopotamia, and Abraham was a pretty old guy when he leaves this cosmopolitan huge kingdom behind to become an agrarian nomad, because he breaks from the polytheism and the society that was there in what we, in biblical terms, what we call Ur of the Chaldees, but is all historically known as the Hurrian Empire.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
And so so obviously these things that Abraham is practicing, and also even his sons, like with Jacob, with his two wives, and then their respective concubines, they are still practicing the law of the land that God had called them out of. And you see these kinds of practices begin to dissipate for the most part, as you continue on down the line in Israelite society, and as it becomes more codified and consistent. But this narrative is in no way portrayed in a positive light. I mean, I can't imagine anyone reading the narrative and sitting there, getting this point, this part in the story. Abraham and Sarah are both barren. They have no kids. And then Sarah gets this idea. Like, the narrative is written with the intention that we as the audience are screaming, no, don't do it. This is a terrible idea. And then here Abraham is, and he's just like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. And then, we're like pulling our hair, like, no, don't do it. God has just promised that he is going to provide the seed. And here Abraham and Sarah are messing it up. So to use Genesis 16 as a biblical, paradigm for marriage that then is supposed to counteract the idea of the nuclear family, it doesn't work, because it defeats its own premise, because Genesis 16 is another defense, just as as we've been talking about, that defends the sanctity and the importance and the role of one man and one woman producing children, or not producing children together, unless there is a miraculous occurrence like Abraham and Sarah.
Well, yeah. Well, and that one ends in like a whole bunch of problems. I mean, just the whole splitting of everything at that point. I mean, just issue after issue for not doing that right. So as we kind of round the corner with 20 minutes left, we'll get to the man and woman, the nuclear family. And the interesting thing is, because I think as Christians, we need to be very careful not to do this as some of the opponents, whoever made this graph did, right? So they know that the idea of a man and woman nuclear family set up in Genesis 2:24 is what we were going to say, hey, this is the way it's supposed to go. But in order to make that sound not good, we get this idea that wives are subordinate to their husbands, which is, oh no, don't do that. We have interfaith marriages forbidden, which again is later down the line. Clearly, there's a reason that is enacted as it is. Then we have marriages arranged, so it's not based on romantic love, which is ironic because, again, given history and what you see in history, that's a fairly new concept. I mean, that's a pretty new idea. And then you have brides cannot prove, and then we end with we're going to murder someone now. The brides cannot prove their virginity, and then they were stoned to death, which is a very condensed version of those verses of what we're looking at as far as what the purpose of that was for.
It's
and
also
not in
exactly
Genesis
accurate either.
I'm sorry.
Right? They jumped to Deuteronomy with that last one. That's not in Genesis 24, right? Or 2:24.
Yeah. Matt, you said something too?
Oh, I was also going to say that's not entirely accurate, because this is all that particular chapter is also one that is even debated until this day, even amongst the rabbis in academia, about whether that entire chapter is even about virginity, or actually whether it is a law to prevent pedophilia. Because the word there is betula in Hebrew, which means a girl of marriageable age, which is an idiom meaning a girl who is essentially in puberty, is able to bear children in a healthy way, that she is ready for marriage. But that, anyways, we won't get too deep into that. But yeah, that whole thing, it's not an open shut case that entire situation is even about virginity.
Huh. Okay, there you go. Yeah, because when I was looking it up, like all the commentaries and study notes, that's interesting. I need to get another commentary, apparently, from Judaism. That would be very helpful. So somebody in the comments did say that I think something that's helpful. People confuse descriptive with prescriptive, which is something, again, that I think we have to really sort of teach people to do well in regards of saying, it's basically what you said earlier, Josh. Things happen. That doesn't mean the thing that happened is what should have happened anyway, which is why we get a lot of the things we covered in Deuteronomy as far as, okay, if this thing then occurs, this is how you then best handle the horrible thing that did happen and care for the people that are in it. So again, rounding the corner, a little bit of time left as we kind of get into this last section of marriage and what it looks like within Christianity. I think what's going to end up happening if somebody hands you this graph, one, I'm going to go off on a limb here and presume the worst. 9 times out of 10, they're not actually looking for you to go through here and demonstrate to them how this isn't a real thing. This is hey, you don't know what you're talking about, but I don't want to discuss the situation. On the off chance that somebody has a question about this, hopefully, as we've walked through this, that's been helpful to you in regards to saying, okay, let's look it up. Let's look at context. Let's look at culture. Let's look at what's going on. In fact, these laws are actually for the best outcome of the situation. But in those regards, that's a very rare occurrence, at least in my dealings with people, that they're actually interested in going through and learning about this. So as we get into kind of the last section here of, can you still hear me? Yeah, you can. Okay. As we get into this last section here, I just disappeared off the screen, so I didn't know what was going on. As we get into this last section in regards to talking about marriage, then from a Christian perspective, a New Testament perspective, how would you go about, because all of this is Old Testament. All of this, I think, as we've walked through, has demonstrated, hey, this is actually for the care of the society and the people, given terrible situations are going to happen. So we have to have situations in place to take care of them. God has given those to us. But now we're New Testament, right? We're on the other side of the cross. And as we describe, because we're going to have to, let's just be clear. Regardless of how this Respect for Marriage Act goes, which it looks like it's going to pass, this idea that culture, as we progress now, the idea is that marriage is going to just be defined as a relationship between people. It's not even going to be defined as, one man and one woman. So as believers holding to one man, one woman, New Testament view of, what marriage looks like, what would be, if somebody comes up to you and says, okay, well, fine. Whatever, I'll give you the Old Testament passages, but I still don't think that, marriage is, one man, one woman. What proof do you have that that's, God's intent? Josh, what would you kind of intro with? Because here's the thing, we're all going to have this conversation if you haven't already had it. So what would be your...
Sure. So I would start with Matthew 19, right? When the Pharisees come and try to trip up Jesus, asking him about divorce, he goes to Genesis 2:24. and quotes that verse verbatim and says, from the beginning it was so, right? What man has joined together, let not man separate. And so he goes right back to the beginning, to the literal, actual root of the matter, And it says, from the beginning, it was man and woman being joined together into one flesh, right? That's the intent. That's what it is. And that's how Jesus saw it in his day. And then from there, I would probably jump through the epistles and hit, 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul is going through and outlining all the various instances of marriage and divorce and remarriage. It's always between one man and one woman. With, there's variance in there that Paul is allowing for and just kind of saying, hey, here's how you work through these things. But it's always ultimately one man and one woman. And then lastly, I'd probably go to Timothy and the qualifications for elders and deacons. Is that, especially for an elder, right, you're a one woman man, right? That's the general gist of what that is getting at. That can either mean, you're married to one woman your whole life, or you only ever married to one woman at a time, right? In the event that you either allow for divorce in that office, or, your wife died and he is remarried, but he's only ever, loyal and faithful to one woman at a time. And so the consistent picture through the New Testament is that of a single man and a single woman coming together in marriage and being united in one flesh, with the goal and intention of not being separated on this side of death.
Gotcha. What you got, Matt?
I mean, there's not much more that I can add to that. I mean, Josh pretty much
Look at him. He's like flex.
Hit all the nails on the head. I mean, that was extremely comprehensive, and he hit all of the major areas. I think that the only other thing that I would just offer, specifically in Matthew 19, and this is also reflecting back onto the Old Testament, because ultimately, even though we tend to give priority to the New Testament as our rule for faith and living and structure, the New Testament becomes a little bit of a vacuum or an empty kernel without the Old Testament. And so we have to look at the ways in which the New Testament interprets and reinterprets the Old Testament. And what I've always found extremely interesting in Matthew 19 is that although this is concerning divorce, but I think that it is applicable in a wider sense to everything that we're talking about here, because in Matthew 19, they respond to Jesus's reference to Genesis 2 as the paradigm for what marriage should be, and so the Pharisees say to Jesus, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and to send her away? And Jesus responds, and he says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted these things.
Yeah.
But from the beginning, it was not always that way. And so this is kind of treading through some dangerous territory. But are we going to correct Jesus and say, whoa, Lord, now that was God's word? That wasn't Moses's words. That was what God said.
Right.
And so how do you balance our understanding of canonicity and authority of Scripture in both Old and New Testament with Jesus's concession that this was Moses who permitted it, and he permitted it because of the hardness of your heart? So that then begs the question, what else in these difficult passages that we have been trying to handle, taking into account Josh's awesome mention of case law, that these things arose because of specific situations, much like the things that occasion Paul's epistles in the New Testament. Paul's epistles are sort of like apostolic case law in a certain sense.
Sure.
What else is going on in the Old Testament and in the Mosaic law, as Jesus says, that is there from Moses, we'll say from God by Moses, because and due to the social, cultural, fleshly constraints of humanity in that in that setting that we have to take into account in our approach to those texts. And so it goes backwards even from just exegesis, and we have to step back
Right.
to our hermeneutical preconceptions that we are bringing to the text to interpret the text before we even begin to ask what the text means.
Yeah.
So,
hey, I think that sounds like a good live in a couple weeks. We can get to maybe discuss some of that. I think that well, we'll talk about it later after we get off the live. So what I would say, kind of to end this, then, is that I think one of the things that that I've said before, because again, not all of the things we've covered tonight come up, but often the polygamy thing does for sure. That what I've already said, I'll just repeat in regards to the fact that there are things put in place that God does allow, I guess, as you put it, for the better, the care for people in terrible situations. And one of the things that we see, for example, even with the Solomon and all of his wives, or even the Abraham situation, is that you can do things, but they're not going to end well. They're not, because they're not working within the design given. They're not going to end well, and that also applies to one man, one woman. If you don't operate within the standard that God has given you, it's probably not going to end well for you either, even though you're still operating within that. So, one of the things I think, again, that has to be admitted is that obviously this is a Christian belief. Anyone outside of Christian belief isn't going to hold to this, likely, even though ironically there are even some atheists that are like, no, this is the better option, to do it the Christian way because it works better. So I mean, that's the thing, that as we kind of declare whether culture says it's a good idea, whether government says it's a rule of law or not, as Christians declare marriage, this covenant between two people, is meant only and exclusively for one man, one woman for life, that we're able to speak through these situations and say, not only is this the design, but it actually brings the better outcome, not only for these people involved, but for society. It is better for the society that we're in. And I think Matt, I don't think we've talked about it on live, but I know in maybe a group chat or text we've talked about it. Even historically, you see when that starts to fall apart, the societies in general start to get into a ton of trouble because it breaks down societal foundations that innately work better when they are followed one man, one woman. So there's a whole conversation I'm sure we can have there too. Is there anything you guys want to end on before we push the stop button tonight?
I'll just say this really quickly. I will just bring our attention to the fact that marriage between one man and one woman is the very first human institution blessed and commanded by God in Scripture, in creation. And even though it is something that is temporal in the long run and in the view of eternity, it is still an integral part of God's good creation. And so when we as Christians support our understanding, our definitions of marriage, we are not trying to put marriage into a box and restrict choice and freedom and availability and fun or whatever it may be, but we are trying to place it in the context to where we can experience the greatest and highest good of and from marriage as possible. Like we're trying to help. We're not trying to constrict and be wet rags.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, Josh, you can go now, I guess.
Thanks. Well, so in the New Testament, Paul refers to the Old Testament law. I believe in Philippians, at least the King James, he calls it the schoolmaster, right? And that's this idea that we look back at the law and we realize how sinful man is, and we realize that this law is impossible to be kept, and that's good because now that should be pointing us to Christ, who has fulfilled this law. And so as you look at all of these issues, you look at all these outliers and these things that seem really off. Well, good. turn to Jesus Christ because he can fix these things, right? Turn to the Lord because these situations, some of them still exist today. There are worse things in the world. And Jesus Christ is the answer for all of them. And so even today, when you go and you read the Pentateuch and you see something like this, you should immediately be thinking, okay, I need to turn to the Lord because the Lord can take care of all of these things. Whether it's the perpetrator or the victim or whatever the situation is, he's the answer. And even to this day, the Pentateuch is pointing us to that better Redeemer, to that better God who has fulfilled the law for us.
Awesome. Good deal. All right. Well, another one in the books, guys. If you guys are watching, you like these conversations, again, make sure you like, subscribe. I appreciate we got some comments tonight. That was helpful as well. Next week, if you're watching this and you tune in every Tuesday night, next week we have a discussion on universalism. That should be incredibly interesting. I'm just going to sit back and be like, there you go, guys. You discuss. We're going to bring some notes and a notepad to take some notes on. So that'll be next week at the same time, 7 to 8 Eastern Standard Time, the universal discussion on that. Hopefully this has been helpful to you in learning, hopefully culture context. Matt, real quick before we end, I think it would be, is there a place, for example, that the layman could go to maybe pick up some of this information that you've shared with us tonight, right? Because there's people that are like, well, that's great that you know that, but I don't know that. So where's maybe some just real quick references? I'm just thinking before we get off here that, like, if they're presented with this, that you would recommend?
Off the top of my head, I think I'm saying this right, the Jewish Virtual Library, Jerusalem Virtual Library. But if you want some interesting, some really good, and sometimes some really awkward commentary on the Old Testament from a strictly historical Jewish perspective, from the rabbis all the way from the end of the first century AD all the way up through the medieval era. You can find a lot of these resources online. Don't be a lazy researcher and base what you're studying on just like a random article that somebody else has written. Like, it's good to read those things, but like in the academic world, we have to provide footnotes for a reason. So click on footnotes, go to what we call the primary sources, which are going to be these online compilable databases that Judaism has provided for us to access. And you can do searches, you can go by topics. I mean, it's simply kind of akin to going to a Christian website or database and doing searches. And so you'll get a lot of perspectives that will help you see certain things better, and in my opinion will even help you to see Christ better in the places that Judaism has missed Christ, and also in the places that we have found Christ, but they open our eyes even a little wider to the circumspect way that we as modern Westerners don't see those things in the Old Testament that Jesus came and fulfilled.
Good deal. All right. I just want to throw that out there because I know there's going to be people that probably had that question. So hopefully that helps you guys. Again, I'm trusting that you are benefiting from these videos. Hopefully, again, helping you use discernment in all of the aspects of life when you're handed sort of stuff like this in culture and what's going on in our society. So hopefully that's helpful, guys. We'll see you. Well, I'll see you next week. See ya.